This is a review of my lecture on the growing urban culture of the late 19th century in the United States. And the emphasis of this particular slideshow is on accommodating the population of the new immigrants and then eventually the emergence of a new urban culture. The new immigrants were very different from the immigrants, the first big wave of immigrants that came after the formation of the United States. So there is a difference between what were known as the old immigrants. These were the mostly Irish and German immigrants who came in 1830s and 1840s from northern and western Europe. They were a group of people who were largely Protestant, many of them English-speaking and politically not very radical, not that different, at least from the traditional types of government that Americans had been familiar with and been accustomed to. The new immigrants, however, were drastically different, coming in the 1880s all the way to the 20th century. These people came largely from Southern and Eastern Europe, from places like Italy, Greece, Hungary, Poland, Russia. They had different religions than what Americans were used to. There were Catholics from Italy, Eastern Orthodox from places like Greece, or Jewish from places in Russia. They had very unusual languages that Americans had never heard before, and politically they were much more likely to be what was considered in the United States to be radical, maybe socialist, communist, anarchist. And as you can probably imagine, the reaction to these new immigrants was an extreme wave of nativism that swept throughout the country and will ultimately in the 20th century lead to a couple of Red Scares. Now, up to this point, there had been pretty much an open door for these immigrants, for all immigrants, and that door is still pretty much open during this period, but you're going to start to see some accommodations, some restrictions put in place. For example, the development of Ellis Island. Ellis Island opens in the 1890s, and it is a processing center. It is not a welcome center. It is a place to process immigrants and to guarantee their suitability for entrance. When immigrants came through to Ellis Island in order to get on the ferry that would take them to the New World, they had to pretty much pass some inspections, health inspections, political inspections, questions about their poverty, questions about their family, make sure that they were not going to become a danger to the United States. That being said, most of these immigrants did get in. Only about 2% of immigrants who came through Ellis Island during its existence from the 1890s and the 1950s were ever turned away. Now, there was also a West Coast version of Ellis Island that has less notoriety. It's known as Angel Island. A lot of Asian immigrants came through Angel Island, which is just outside of San Francisco. And as you can see, very similar to what happened at Ellis Island. Some immediate challenges for immigrants that they faced when they got here: finding work, finding a place to live, finding friends and family that already lived here, dealing with the language barrier, because there was a substantial language barrier for these new immigrants, facing discrimination. Again, the nativism, the hatred of immigrants that existed extremely high among Americans who lived here, who were afraid that their country was going to be changed. And also getting conned. There were a lot of con men who would prey on the Native Americans and perhaps cause lots of problems. Okay, and a lot of these Americans, they did accommodate a lot of these immigrants did accommodate to the American style of dress and attitude. This is a great cartoon kind of showing you the hypocrisy, perhaps, of the nativists as these men are trying to stop an immigrant from coming into the United States. Meanwhile, if you look at the shadows that they cast, they are casting shadows of their own immigrant backgrounds. Now, there are a lot of things that were necessary in order to help immigrants adjust to living in the United States. They had to find a place to live. Many of the immigrants crowded into dumbbell tenements. Dumbbell tenements were some cheap living places for immigrants, mostly for immigrants that were predominant in New York City's Lower East Side. Here's what dumbbell tenements would look like today. And in these neighborhoods, there was a tremendous amount of poverty, as shown by Jacob Riis's book in 1890, How the Other Half Lives. Riis was a historian, social worker, photographer, and he kind of brought to light how many of these poverty-stricken immigrants were living in the United States, which of course fueled some of the anger and hatred that existed among the nativists. Anyway, these people are moving into ghettos, neighborhoods with people of similar background. It was very common for these ethnic neighborhoods to be born, whether it be Italian neighborhoods made up predominantly of European Jews, Chinese neighborhoods in New York City. These neighborhoods paled in comparison to the more established, more traditional, wealthier areas of places like New York City. Another accommodation made for the immigrants is the help of the government. The government, helped them, but also used the immigrants to gain personal power. And these governments were known as political machines. Political machines provided aid to the immigrants. The most famous political machine was Tammany Hall in New York, the Democratic machine run by William Marcy Tweed, known as Boss Tweed. Now, Tammany Hall, basically the way this worked was that machine men, Tammany Hall men, would go around door to door and they would ask immigrants, what do you need? What can we provide for you? And then they would get the things that the immigrants would need. And the one thing they would ask, of course, of the immigrants is, by the way, there's an election coming up. Remember to vote for, our people when that election comes up. So that was a way that the machine government did actually provide some services, but also manipulated and used the immigrants in order to build their own personal political stranglehold over the government in that particular city. Not all political machines are corrupt, but many of them were. And Boss Tweed's was notoriously corrupt, at least according to his enemies. Cartoonists like Thomas Nast would highlight the negative side of Boss Tweed. This is him depicted with the money bag as a head. Lots of different cartoons showing the rather large, corpulent, greedy Boss Tweed, who is in this, here you see him walking out of the New York City Treasury, seemingly taking money away. The policemen are saluting him, and yet the policemen on the bottom are beating the man who is stealing bread in order to feed his family. Okay. It was long believed that Boss Tweed was too big to be taken down by the lawmen, but he will ultimately be charged with crimes and arrested for the corruption that he was guilty of. Okay, another aid to immigrants were settlement houses. Settlement houses were places where in these immigrant neighborhoods that were established. They were mostly made up of middle-class women who lived at these immigrant settlement houses, and what they did was they worked with the immigrants. They taught them classes, trying to teach them English, holding art classes, holding cultural celebrations that allowed them to celebrate their culture, and also learn about American culture so they could blend the two together. Again, the most famous settlement house was Hull House in Chicago, which was run by Jane Addams. And here you can see an art class meeting outside the settlement house. Again, these women lived at the settlement house in these immigrant neighborhoods, and they were a place for many of the immigrants to come and learn about American society. Now, in the process, you see the development of an emerging urban culture. Okay? Celebrated in things like the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Cities are being celebrated for their majesty, their architecture, and their ability to draw people from all over the world. But cities also had some problems, obviously, as seen in the previous slides, some crime, some pretty gritty neighborhoods, a lot of poverty. So one of the things that you start to see is a a desire to start improving some of those cities. And Frederick Law Olmsted is a great example of this. Olmsted was a landscape architect, and he helped design parks. It was believed that cities needed to have parks, kind of an oasis in the middle of an urban jungle, and a place where people could go and still get a feel for that pastoral, natural environment that they had lost when they moved in to a crowded city. And you start to see an emphasis also on leisure activities, whether it be riding bicycles, going to amusement parks like Coney Island, going to Forest Park Highlands in St. Louis, a popular early 20th century amusement park, and going to playing in the street with their friends, very dangerous. Vaudeville shows provided early entertainment, theaters, and spectator sports like the most popular sport at the turn of the century, America's pastime, baseball. You start to see the emergence of this new culture, and that culture will grow, and we will look at the more at this culture when we start talking about the 1920s in a couple more weeks.